Stanley did such a masterful job earlier this afternoon talking about the Trump administration approach. And if you're anything like me, you're a little bit exhausted talking about Trump and what Trump means for the Asia-Pacific. So what I'd like to do is sort of interpret the mandate that Richard gave me a little bit more broadly and talk about what I think are some of the most important dynamics in the region, but drawing on the two-panel discussions. And I really want to give Richard and his colleagues at Brookings an enormous amount of credit, because the way that they designed this conference, I think, brings out probably the most important dynamic that's going to shape the future of the Asia-Pacific. And that's basically, simply put, the relationship between economics and politics. The relationship between economics and security. The relationship between economics and security in the Asia-Pacific is going to define the order, it's going to define the architecture, and ultimately it's going to define the power relationships for Asia going forward. Simply put, it comes down to, on the one hand, the extent to which economics, and by economics I mean trade, investment, and finance, constrains and enables security relationships, and on the other side of the equation, to what extent do security ties constrain or enable economic ties. And these issues are critical for a part of the world that is the fastest growing region in the world. It accounts for 40% of global output and 2/3 of global growth. I mean, think about those figures. It's extraordinary. One part of the world, the Asia-Pacific, accounts for 40% of global GDP and two-thirds of global growth. And interestingly, there's actually been very little research and writing that's been done on the relationship between economics and security in the Asia-Pacific. There's some wonderful articles that Evan Feigenbaum and Bob Manning have done, but they posit a competition between security and economics. They call it the two Asias. There's the economic Asia and the security Asia. And I think that's a fascinating way to look at it. I just happen to disagree with it. I don't think it's a competition in the sense that either one will dominate or the other will dominate, but rather the issue that I think will really shape the order, the architecture, and ultimately the power relationships in the region is sort of how does security and economics net out? To what extent do they constrain or enable the each other as East Asia pursues both security competition and economic integration? So if you remember one thing about the presentation today, remember this point, that East Asia is going through a very interesting period in which we're simultaneously seeing more economic integration, and the panel very nicely today highlighted the many manifestations of the growing economic integration, but simultaneous with economic integration is more security competition and more security fragmentation. And the reason why that's important and interesting is because the history and the theory of international relations would tell you the exact opposite. All of the international relations theory that's out there, unfortunately, most of it is derived from experience during both the Cold War and World War II, is that economic integration ultimately leads to some degree of political accommodation and ultimately security pacification. But interestingly, that's not happening in the Asia-Pacific at all. You're not seeing economic integration leading to that political accommodation and that security pacification. And even though there are some large economies in East Asia that wished that their ability to extend trade and investment ties would lead to political accommodation, that's not happening. So just consider a couple facts. On the economic front, it's very clear that economic integration is occurring. Look at the support for TPP. Look at the fact that there's so much emphasis on RCEP now that the U.S. is withdrawn from TPP. If you look at the most recent and significant initiatives in the region for economic integration, what is it? It's AIIB, One Belt, One Road, efforts to renovate and re-energize the Asian Development Bank, and even then there are non-Asian institutions like the EBRD that are looking at playing a more active role in the Asia-Pacific. So it's pretty clear that both at a bilateral and an institutional level, we've got more economic integration. But consider the other part of the equation, security competition, security fragmentation. Number one, over the last decade, we've seen a tighter alignment of U.S. alliances. Obviously, that's going through a big transition now. We have to see what the Trump administration does. But certainly from my experience in the Obama administration, we saw a very significant and consistent demand for a greater role for the United States and a greater emphasis on alliances, and that's across the board. Number two, and I'll talk about this trend in a second, we've seen greater security diversification. In other words, the model that everybody always talks about is hubs and spokes. What we've seen emerge in the last 5 years is greater spoke-on-spoke type of interaction in which you have a variety of middle powers that are doing more. And then, of course, a third aspect of security competition and fragmentation is just simply the fact that we're now seeing a variety of economies, India, of course, China, to some degree Japan, interestingly and newly Taiwan, invest in their local defense industries, albeit while relying on some foreign investment. So I think it's pretty clear that that it's empirically accurate that there's more economic integration while security, competition, and fragmentation grows. The question is, where is this headed? So what I'd argue is that there's four very interesting variables that we should watch, and these are the four variables I want to leave you with today that hopefully brings together the two panels. There are four variables that will shape the extent to which economics and security either mutually enable or constrain one another. The four variables are China, the security architecture, trade regimes, and of course the U.S. role in Asia. Let me tick through these very, very briefly. First, on China. How China acts in the region and how the region responds to China will in a large part dictate the relationship between economics and security. China has many, many different dimensions to it in this regard. Number one is that China is no longer emerging as an unqualified source of prosperity for many countries in this region. So the notion that as the Chinese economy continues to grow and expand, albeit at a decelerated pace from the past, will that or will it not lead to create greater accommodation? My argument would be it's not, because the Chinese economy is slowing. The Chinese economy is rebalancing, as David Dollar very articulately pointed out, from investment in exports to consumption and services, and that is simply changing the nature of its economic relationship with countries in the region. For example, if you're a commodity exporter, Indonesia, Malaysia to some degree, and Australia, China's slowdown, its rebalancing, its shift away from heavy investment in the property sector means that sustaining a high degree of exports from China is no longer going to be a big driver of your trade relationship with China. Number two, if you're an exporter of intermediate products for final assembly and then export from China, Thailand and Malaysia are two of the most obvious examples of that. As China moves up the value chain, as China onshores many of its production, what we're seeing is the beginnings of a collapse of these regional production chains with ASEAN and China as the key players. Interestingly, I believe that as China expands its use of automation, in particular automation for things like automobiles, you're going to see an added pressure and collapse on the regional supply chain because, simply put, China can produce a lot more of its own products. Why does it need to rely on imports of intermediate products from the likes of Thailand and Malaysia? Also, as China moves up the value chain, China is becoming a source of competition. So, for example, take South Korea. If you're a South Korean company that's involved in shipbuilding, IT, Samsung's a great example, or petrochemicals, China's investment in those industries over the last 10 years has now made China an enormous competitor to you. So whereas in the past trade relations between, let's say, China and South Korea or even Japan was highly complementary, as China moves up the value chain, we're seeing trade with China becoming a source of competition. So that's an area where trade with China is not increasingly going to lead to questions about political accommodation, but rather economic trade and investment with China may lead to and be a source of more competition. Second interesting aspect of economic relations with China. As China expands its trade and investment links, increasingly in the region, there is a conversation emerging about the so-called China risk. In other words, the desire to reduce vulnerability to trade and investment with China. In the last 2 years, China has imposed trade and investment sanctions on the following actors for disagreeing with them: Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines, and most recently South Korea in a very, very high-profile way. The question is, what kind of effect is that having on popular sentiment and business sentiment? I think it's still early days, but there's some interesting initial indicators. I get this in some of my work at Eurasia Group, where we have our clients coming to us and talking about the China risk. In South Korea, there have been a variety of polls. There's just recently a new ASEAN poll out today that talks about how rates China as the least preferred country for doing business after North Korea. Now, I'll grant that South Korean sentiments about China are fairly volatile. They change pretty quickly, but nonetheless, it'll be very interesting to see over the next 3 years if we see a sustained shift in business sentiment in South Korea. Also recently, there were some very interesting surveys done by JBIC, the Japanese government-sponsored investment bank, in which China has moved from the #1 most favorable source to investment now to #3 after India and Vietnam. Now, of course, there's good economic reasons for doing that, but for those of you that study Japan, the sort of mood and the shift toward the so-called China +1 strategy has only gained more momentum in recent years, and of course, the Chinese playing around with sanctions over rare earths have had an effect as well. Now, of course, that said, China still offers an enormous amount economically for the region. It's the largest economy. It's still growing at a fairly rapid pace. And most importantly, China is leveraging one of its greatest resources, which is the ability to marshal enormous amounts of government resources for overseas investment. Simply put, the fact that China can offer hundreds of billions of dollars of investment overseas, especially in infrastructure, at a time when infrastructure bottlenecks are one of the biggest structural challenges to regional economies to grow, that offers China an enormous advantage. The last factor to think about in the economics and security relationship with China is the military one. Simply put, the PLA is growing, it's modernizing, and it's only becoming more active and present in Asia. That is clearly accentuating security dilemma dynamics in the region, and the question is, how will that manifest in economic behavior? So, China clearly, and different trends in the Chinese economy are going to affect this relationship. Variable number 2 to look at is the regional security architecture. As I mentioned before, middle powers in Asia are increasingly focused on security diversification, spoke-on-spoke interaction in ways that outpace past trends. I think it's the most interesting trend in regional security affairs. What it amounts to ultimately in terms of shaping power relationships in the region is unclear, but the fact that you have new geometries like Japan-India, Japan-Australia, India-Australia, Japan-Vietnam, Vietnam, the Philippines, and even Philippines-Indonesia, Myanmar, and Malaysia, these new dyads cannot be ignored. And in almost every one of these cases, there's a strong overlap between security cooperation and economic cooperation. Now, in part, that's because you have very smart powers like Japan that use the economic component, trade investment component, to reinforce the security component. But nonetheless, I think that the extent to which this kind of middle power cooperation is matched by an economic component, I think raises very interesting questions about whether or not we will see even more economic integration at the same time that we see more security competition. The third variable to look at is Asian trade regimes. So stepping back from the security equation and the growing interaction between middle powers, what's going on in the trade and investment story? And really, the big economic story in Asia is what's going to drive the next round of trade liberalization. Now that the U.S. has withdrawn from TPP, I'd offer that we all look at a couple variables. Number one, what happens to the TPP-11? Do they go out on their own? Do they seek to consolidate their gains and hope that the U.S. changes its mind at some point in the future? Early indications are very unclear. There was a very interesting meeting in Chile just last week in which my understanding is that Chile and Australia, and to some degree Japan, were interested in breaking away. Obviously, that means modifying the articles of TPP in order to ensure that the TPP-11 go forward. But if the TPP then don't sort of formalize themselves in a TPP-11 type of agreement, what does that mean for other regional agreements? So that raises the obvious question, what's going to happen with RCEP? Here's the interesting thing about RCEP. Negotiations have been going on beginning 2012, 2013, depending on how you count. But there have been 17 rounds of negotiations to date. The RCEP negotiators would like to complete the agreement by the end of this year because, as Joseph rightly pointed out, it's ASEAN's 50th anniversary, and what better way to cap off an anniversary with a big, new, fancy trade agreement. But the kind of barriers to progress by the end of this year are very, very substantial. Number one, there hasn't been basic agreement on the scope of tariff liberalization. Are they going to try and liberalize 90% of the tariff lines, 80%, 85%, or are they going to pursue a differential approach? So the most basic fundamental questions haven't been agreed upon. Number two, the differences and disagreements between China and India on the ambition of the agreement is proving to be more problematic and contentious in the negotiations than the Japan-China dynamic. In fact, Japan's smart efforts to raise the standards have actually been met with a fairly positive response from the Chinese, who, as we all know, are now trying to position themselves as one of the leaders of globalization. Number three, ASEAN remains fairly resistant on services liberalization, and if ASEAN's ever going to make significant progress on the ASEAN economic community, it's going to require major liberalization of services, especially financial services. That's the one area of liberalization that could open up new sources of prosperity. And then, of course, as I suggested at the beginning, the timeline is very, very aggressive. I think it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to reach an agreement by the end of the year. There may be, it's possible that a framework agreement will be reached by the end of the year, but an actual trade agreement looks hard. A key factor to watch is what I call the Asian Seven. These are the members of TPP who are also members of RCEP: Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei. They're going to be a very influential, very important swing party in understanding what happens with TPP, but ultimately how ambitious RCEP is going to be. Third factor to watch, the Pacific Alliance. Now, it's called the Pacific Alliance, but it's actually a Latin American trading bloc that includes Chile, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia. Watch them. If TPP-11 doesn't go forward, there could be a very interesting convergence between the Latin American members of TPP, Mexico, Peru, and Chile, and RCEP. Do they make a bid to join RCEP? How does that affect RCEP negotiations? It was interesting because Chile hosted this meeting last week, and of course Chile, Mexico, and Peru were there, but they also invited Colombia as well, the fourth member of the Pacific Alliance. And then, of course, lastly, we have to watch what happens with OBOR and AIIB. So watch the future of Asian trade regimes. That's going to define the next round of trade and investment liberalization, and it will tell us a lot about the extent to which it does or doesn't constrain the security, competition, and diversification. And, of course, lastly, the last issue is the U.S. role in Asia and Trump. A lot has been said. Stanley Roth gave us an excellent framework for assessing. All I would say is, number one, of course there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety because it is early days. There's no clear strategy. There's been a heavy focus on Northeast Asia. Their interest in Southeast Asia is unclear. And we don't really understand how Asia does or doesn't fit in to sort of Trump's broader foreign policy world. Number two, I think we need to look at the extent to which what Trump does domestically in the U.S. and internationally actually becomes a domestic political liability for other governments. I share Stanley Roth's concern about the way in which the Prime Minister of Australia was treated, not tweeted. Actually, he probably was both treated and tweeted poorly. But my point is, if Trump, for example, takes a very, very difficult, very tough position on Muslims and Islam, especially as the fight against ISIS expands, I think it could create real tensions and constraints in the ability to strike good relations with Indonesia and Malaysia. So Trump's policy could create domestic political risk and liabilities for countries in the region. Of course, there's the question of, does Trump have an economic agenda for the region? I think we all would like to hear what his strategy is absent TPP. And then ultimately, what's his China policy really going to look like? I thought Sam did a wonderful job explaining the sort of sine wave of ups and downs. I mean, it's just exhausting trying to watch the U.S.-China relationship and figure out what trajectory it's on. But that will have, obviously, a very defining influence on economics and security. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to, if there's one or two questions, happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evan. That was outstanding. I have to apologize to my colleague, Jonathan Stromseth. He was supposed to introduce Evan, and I know he was looking forward to doing so. But I was just
I was looking forward to receiving the presumptive accolades, Jonathan.
I was just on autopilot and forgot, but I feel very badly about that.
Can I ask the first question?
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Thanks, Richard. No
Okay.
problem. Evan, I just wanted to follow up maybe on...
Wait for the mic, Jonathan.
You can repeat your introduction now if you'd like.
That's okay. It's good we've known each other a long time.
Yeah, we've known each other a long time.
I just wanted to follow up like a theme that Stanley introduced. I think Joseph obviously touched on, and you've now touched on now. As someone who was instrumental in formulating the rebalance and also the focus on Southeast Asia and the emphasis and the regular visits of President Obama and other senior officials to Southeast Asia, I just want to ask you, if I could, what are your concerns and worries if that doesn't really come into the picture of the Trump Asia policy, and particularly as we come up to the fall and we have APEC and EAS and ASEAN summits and so on, and if the president doesn't go there?
So, as you know, Jonathan, and based on my work when I was in government, I think Southeast Asia is a region of enduring economic significance and strategic importance to the United States. So, aside from the obvious demographic issues, you put all the economies together, and it's the fourth largest economy in the world by GDP. It's America, in aggregate, America's seventh largest trading partner. And then, of course, the United States has a longstanding and very substantial stock of FDI in the region. So economically, it carries a lot of weight. It has some of the most dynamic and fast-growing economies in the world. Just look at the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, as a case in point. And then strategically, I mean, it's very clear that it is one of the arenas for competition between the United States and China for influence. And it's not just over the South China Sea. It's, other issues as well. So there's no question that it's of enduring value to the United States. I think the Trump administration, they have made some initial moves on Southeast Asia. Tillerson met with all of the ASEAN ambassadors here in Washington. My understanding is he has invited all of the ASEAN foreign ministers to Washington, and that meeting will occur in April or May. They're talking with the Vietnamese of potentially having the Vietnamese Prime Minister Phuc, come and visit Washington. And then, of course, there's the question of whether or not he'll attend EAS. So there's no momentum. But I think the principal cost involved is just a missed opportunity, right? I mean, as Joseph, I think, very nicely pointed out, if ASEAN is constantly worried about being pulled between the United States and China, and the United States is not there, obviously that changes the strategic equation. I don't think it changes the strategic equation to such a point at which you'll begin to see Southeast Asian countries undermining their own economic and security interests simply because China's the only game in town. I mean, the United States, it has a strong incumbent presence in Southeast Asia that doesn't vanish overnight. I largely see it in terms of the United States losing out an enormous opportunity for one of the fastest growing parts of the world that is at the center of this issue of who will define the security order for East Asia. And as I said, there are, the U.S. has strong views, China has strong views, Japan has views, India is getting more involved, and I think ASEAN, or I should say Southeast Asian countries, have a role to play in that question.
Okay, also, the Navarro and other people wrote in foreign policy article that United States, the case of TPP, oversold security dimensions of TPP and then sacrificed economics benefits. And then it said that you will never do that again. Do you think that, clearly there's, you talked about the security economics nexus. Do you think that the United States will not use, that kind of, security implications of the economic deals in the future? And second is that the other way around, USTR and in recent report that, United States will use every average to open the foreign markets. And do you predict that they will also use kind of, defense commitment as a leverage to twist arms of your allies economically in economic deals, hypothetically?
Sure. So the last thing I'm going to do is make any predictions about the Trump administration. I've talked with some of them from time to time. Very difficult to understand their approach to these kinds of questions. What I will say is sort of looking at the broad arc, the broad bipartisan arc of U.S. ties with Asia, it's pretty seldom that the United States has ever used its security commitments as a way to leverage market access and market opening on economic questions, because that's obviously a very costly strategy. It calls into question the credibility of those commitments because they seem to be a function of economic openness. So there's not much. The U.S. doesn't have much of a track record, but it's difficult to say whether or not Trump would seek to use that particular source of leverage. What I would say is on the flip side, I think it's very well understood as a matter of sort of general bipartisan consensus that increasingly trade and investment issues in the Asia-Pacific should be seen in strategic terms. In other words, they influence the power relationships across the region. And that was one of the logics behind TPP. I remember when we were debating TPP, we were debating joining EAS, we were looking for an economic component for the rebalancing strategy. There was a broad-based recognition that those countries or group of countries that shape rules and norms regarding trade and investment will shape strategic affairs and power relationships. So I would say that I think there's a broad recognition across the spectrum in the United States that in the Asia-Pacific, economics is security, economics and ultimately is strategy. What Trump will do, whether or not they share that recognition, it's hard to say. If they did, it's difficult to understand why they would have so precipitously withdrawn from TPP, as opposed to conduct a policy review, do a cost-benefit analysis, and then say, hey, let's renegotiate aspects of TPP that don't provide sufficient economic benefit, as opposed to simply throwing the baby out with the bathwater. My view is trying to negotiate a series of bilateral trade agreements to replace TPP sort of misses that broader strategic point. And from my conversations in the region, that's how many policymakers in the Asia-Pacific view it. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.